When we talk about literacy, what comes to mind? For many of us, it's the ability to read and write. Simple, right? However, literacy is more than that. Here's a sobering statistic. While most Canadians can read and write, just over half can read and write well enough to reach their full potential. And that means that nearly half of Canadians might be missing out on job opportunities, career growth, income potential, or any other opportunities. And this has broader consequences for our national economy too. Hey there, you're listening to The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host, Scott Crockett, and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. On this episode, we're talking about literacy. Specifically, we're talking about the economics of literacy and why this is an issue that business leaders of all levels should care about. We're joined by Janet Lane, the director of the Human Capital Centre at the Canada West Foundation, to break down the state of literacy in Canada and Alberta, the connection between literacy and the labour market, and what we need in place to improve literacy rates so that everyone can reach their full potential. And if you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give us a quick review and a rating. Otherwise, enjoy this conversation.
Well, Janet, we are absolutely thrilled to have you on the show today. And you and I have been friends for quite some time, and you're obviously well known to lots of our listeners. But just to begin things off, I'd love it if you'd share with us just a little bit about you, who you are, what you do, and why do you do it?
Well, thank you, Scott. So I'm the director of the Human Capital Centre at the Canada West Foundation, and that is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank based here in Calgary. And we spend a lot of time looking at issues of interest to the West. But because I look at human capital, a lot of what I do is of interest nationally as well. So that's my day job. So I'm looking at skills development, workforce development, competencies, all of those kinds of things. And I got here from literacy and essential skills. I spent 15 years in that field, first of all in family literacy, and then, really into adult literacy. And I ran an organization that was provincially based that was called Literacy Alberta for a fair number of years, worked with a great team there to help build literacy skills in Alberta. But prior to that, I'd spent 20 years in the workforce in the financial services sector, always wondering why I wasn't really happy. I had done, I'd been in the money markets, I had been a portfolio manager, I had been a financial planner, I had done, the full gamut. I started off in accounting, but my first degree is in biology. So I had a really varied background, and then wondered why I wasn't happy, figured out, no, Janet, you don't want to make rich people richer. You want to help people to reach their full potential. And it's, to me, every person has a gift that they need to bring to the world. And it's their job in life to find that gift, to figure out what it is, and then to do the best thing they can to give that gift. And so I find that that's why I'm so drawn to the world and the field of literacy and skills development, because I think for many people, they give that gift through their work, and having the right skills to do that work, to show off that gift, is important.
Well, that's so beautifully said and wonderful, because, there's a lot of topics we could chat with you about in terms of human capital. But today we want to talk literacy, because the reality is Canada has a literacy problem, and it's also a big economic problem. So perhaps we can just start with the basics, Janet. For the benefit of everyone listening, let's do this as a three-part question. What is literacy? How is it measured? And why does it matter? Why should our listeners care about literacy in 2022 in Canada?
Right. So literacy is the capacity to read. That's what everybody thinks it is. And of course, pretty much virtually everybody can read once they've gone through elementary school. But it's so much more than that, because it's not enough to be able to decode the words. You have to be able to understand what you've read, apply what you've read, engage with what you've read, use what you've read in one context in a different context. And so literacy is the fundamental skill that helps the world, the economy, and people's lives to just move along. There's a really important international study that's done every decade or so. We're a little overdue because of the pandemic for the next one here in Canada. And we measure through an interview process. People are asked to respond to questions that are literacy based. They have to read and respond to questions. And it's a very in-depth piece of work that is done. The people who are chosen are, they're engaged for quite a while. It's not a 10-question survey, but it helps the researchers to understand on a 500-point scale where people are placed. And within that 500 points, there are 5 levels. And they're not just a simple 100, in each level. The midpoint is, the point that's really matters in that 500-point scale is 275, which is where people go from level 2 to level 3. And that is really the magic number, because that's where people go from learning how to read to being able to be fluent readers and reading to learn. And that's what happens in the reading process. And so why does it matter? As I said earlier, it is the fundamental skill from which we learn everything else. I mean, there's a lot of hand-on work skills that you can learn just by doing, but if you're going to learn from a textbook or from a manual, or if you're going to learn from whatever social media or any books, novels, newspapers, whatever, that's literacy.
That's really great. And I'm glad that you've outlined that for us, because I've seen these metrics before, the 5-point scale and the 2 out of 5 on the 5-point scale. And we talk about low levels of literacy. And it's always seemed a little bit surprising to me, because my impression is that almost everybody can read, at least, like read a menu or something like that at a restaurant to be able to make an order. But I think you've really clearly shown there how, when we're talking about low levels of literacy, it's not that those folks maybe can't read the menu at McDonald's, it's that they can't read to learn and teach themselves new skills. Is that an accurate framing of it?
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Have you ever tried to read something in a different language?
Yeah.
And that you know enough that you should be able to sort of figure out what this piece is saying, right? If you just look hard enough at it, because let's say it's French or German or a language that's not that different from English in some of those words. And so you should be able to get a sense of what this is about. Mm-hmm. That's what people who can't read fluently in English face every day. And so all their cognition is going to actually decoding what the sentence says. And so by the end of the sentence, they've got it, they've read, but they don't remember what they've read. They don't understand what they've read, because all their brain cells went into figuring out what it said. And if it's a paragraph, that's even worse, right? Like you can maybe get through the first sentence and say, okay, well, that was about that. But by the time you get to the end of the paragraph, you're exhausted. And so the truth is, you don't get to the end of the paragraph. And that's sometimes where the most important information is.
So Scott said, we have a literacy problem in Canada. Unpack that for us. What is the state of literacy in Canada? Where do we do well? Where do we perform quite poorly?
Okay, well, as I said, we're overdue for the next survey. So we don't know for sure what the situation is right now. Mm-hmm. But back when the last survey was done and the results came out in 2013, we found that we're getting close to 50% of Canadians don't read at that level where it's just really fluent. They're reading it, they're getting it, they're being able to apply it immediately. That's the
getting close to 50%,
the level that we need, close to 50%. So as I say, it's not that they can't read, it's just that it takes a little longer to read. It means that they're a little slower in figuring things out and being able to apply it. And you can imagine what that does. It's time, but I think it must be incredibly frustrating. Right. And so you get a little angrier, a little more angry every day. It means that you're not doing your job as well as you might. It means that life is just harder. Life is just harder. And this is the problem, because, there's almost 50%. And so if you're not getting to the end of the paragraph, if you're only reading the headlines, if you're only seeing, something in social media, you're not getting the full knowledge that you need to make good decisions.
And that's Canada. So let's talk about Alberta. What's the state of literacy in Alberta, as far as the most recent information?
Right. Right. Well, Alberta has done better for sure. And in fact, it was interesting because as we looked at the results, we could see BC was the best in Canada. Alberta was the next best and very close. And maybe after that, maybe Ontario was in there. But basically, as you went east from from the Pacific Ocean, rates go down. Not huge differences across the country, because the average, is 48% with level 1 or 2 literacy. But Alberta is at the top, very, very close to the top in the country.
I want to kind of just circle back around to something you said about reading headlines and reading, social media, just some tweets. Do you think that social media and the prevalence of social media has had an impact on literacy rates and our ability to read?
I don't know that that a study has been done to prove that, but it makes sense to me that it would do that because you're getting very small pieces of information and you're reading only very small pieces of information at a given time. And so you're not starting to absorb and understand fully the full situation, right? You're only getting a little bit. So you're not getting the fullness of the information that would have been presented if you had read a full paragraph.
What that makes me think of is, it is maybe the causality is a little bit in the other direction. Not so much that social media would be influencing low levels of literacy, but that, short snippets of information, maybe all that certain individuals are really well equipped to absorb. Right. And that might be why we're getting, why we see some of the other effects we talk about, just reading the headline culture or just skimming the surface of issues and a lack of nuance is probably kind of exacerbated by low levels of literacy.
So I want to dive a little bit deeper into the why we're seeing the literacy rates that we are. I think it was 2019, you put out a policy brief on some myths around literacy and some of the trends that drive literacy rates. Can you unpack some of those myths and some of the key drivers or trends that you've been seeing over the years that are impacting our literacy rates?
Right. Well, the first one, as we've already talked about, is that, well, everybody can read, so we couldn't possibly have a literacy problem. But yes, indeed, everybody can. Almost everybody can decode. But as we've discussed, that doesn't mean that they're really understanding and being able to apply it. Another one, for instance, would be that, well, you go to school, you learn your literacy, and then you're stuck with that level of literacy for the rest of your life. But actually, literacy practice is what makes your literacy level. So if you finish school and never read another book or another newspaper or another piece of text, then your literacy rates can go down. And they do. It's just like any other muscle. And the truth is that there are people with higher levels of education that actually might not have the fullness of literacy that they need. And there are people with fairly low levels of literacy who've been engaged with written material all their lives who might have higher levels of literacy. So education is a proxy for skill, but it doesn't necessarily mean that skill is present. Another one is that, well, it doesn't affect the economy. And, I think we'll talk in a little while about how much it does affect the economy. It is one of the single biggest pieces. In fact, it's the biggest contributor in a developing country. Improving the literacy skills of the population is the biggest driver of increased GDP in a developing country. And it actually is true for even a developed one like ours. Another one is that perhaps, well, it's immigrants that are causing the problem, right? Like if we just didn't have so many immigrants coming in without the language, then our literacy rates wouldn't be so bad. But actually, lately, especially lately, in the last decade or so, we've been bringing to this country and encouraging them to come some very highly educated people. In fact, there are more immigrants with degrees than there are people who were Canadian born with degrees. So it's not that necessarily, but yes, indeed, until they actually get fluent in the language, their literacy in any of the official languages might be lower. Another one might be that as people die, those old people without the literacy skills as they die, we might, things will definitely improve because we've got more people finishing high school now. But that's not working out that way. We're seeing in the numbers that literacy rates are going down, even in a population that has had higher levels of education. So,
So some great myth busting there.
yeah.
Let's talk about one of the things that you brought up, the impact on the economy. So if half of Canadians, or nearly half of Canadians, can't read well enough to reach their full potential, what do you see as the economic impact of that? And as well as the economic impact, what do we risk in terms of leaving people behind in the labor force?
Mhm. So, economically, people who have better literacy skills are more able to adapt, change, grow. They're more able to learn on the job. So, as I said earlier, I had a very varied career before I got to where I am
Yeah.
today, right? And I was blessed to be born in a time where learning to read was back in the days of the 3 R's, right? And we didn't learn a lot of what kids are learning in school right now, but I did learn how to read and how to apply what I was reading. I was one of those kids that used to read with the flashlight under the covers. And so I think that having the good level of literacy skills that I've had has helped me to change jobs, to change actual full careers quickly, right? I remember when I moved into the literacy field, it took me less than 6 months to be considered an expert in the piece of literacy that I was talking about. And so that's a personal example, but having that literacy helps you to get a job, to keep a job, to change in a job. And it also means that productivity is higher. I have a really high level of literacy. Increasing my literacy skills is not going to make me more productive, but increasing somebody at the lower level to help them to understand so that they can read the manual, they can they can much faster read the memo or whatever it is that's coming across their desk. They can then respond to whatever it is they've read faster and then be more productive in their own work, which of course helps their employer to be more competitive, and it helps their employer to make more money, which should help them to earn more money. And then the cycle just continues.
And then they can spend that money in the marketplace. They
Right.
can buy a home or another,
So
or
it
a car,
improves
something like that.
GDP to have higher levels of literacy. And it starts with the individual, it moves to the employer, part of the society, and then to the full economy.
That makes complete sense. And, I think that's an important connection point between business and literacy because, frankly, at the Business Council, we work with lots of large employers. And while they care about things like literacy, it doesn't come up in discussion a lot when you're working with large businesses. It's seen as primarily maybe like a grade school sort of challenge or problem. But I think you're making the case that says, if people can read better in society, they'll most likely be better employees and are able to switch jobs better, and also probably better consumers, for lack of a better term, because they'll be making more money and able to contribute more fully.
Right. Yeah, it is really the full circle.
Well, let's talk about how the workplace is changing. So we're seeing automation, digital disruption, more emphasis being placed on critical thinking skills and analytical skills. So who's most at risk of this shift, and how do we support them to thrive in the future?
Right. And boy, this is a real issue, right? Because in Canada, although we've got a pretty good, we're at the OECD average. I should have said that earlier, right? Like it's a problem, but the rest of the world has a similar problem to some extent. And so we all need to raise all boats, but the people who are most at risk of disruption in the workplace are the people who are at the lower end of their literacy skills. They're doing jobs that don't require higher levels of literacy. They're doing jobs that could be easily automated. And we're seeing that happen, right? And especially when there's a labor shortage, which we're seeing now in the economy, employers begin to realize that rather than raising wages and trying to attract people by just paying more, that it might actually pay them, the employer, to think about automating. And so we can, we're reducing jobs for the people who've got those lower levels of skill. In the past, there were people who could make a really good living just doing manual labor or the kinds of labor that didn't require a lot of cognitive skill. They might have been quite well skilled, but not using cognition as much. And those jobs are the ones that are disappearing. But every single job is changing right now, except according to a study that I was reading this week, mystery shoppers are not experiencing any change in the skills that they need for some strange reason.
Incredibly random. I
Yeah,
love
it's really weird, but it made me laugh. But on the other hand, at the other end of the scale, jobs are changing rapidly. 37% of the most in-demand skills have changed over the last 5 years. And in fact, 20% of the top 20 skills that are in demand, now this is a US-based study, but we have similar economies. 20% of the skills that are in highest demand weren't even on the list in 2016. So
in 2016, yeah, and
yeah,
that's
so in
so
5 years, right? That's because we're only halfway through 2022. So that means that people who are in jobs now are having to adapt, change, and grow constantly. And if they're not able to, they might find that they're getting harder, their job is harder, they're feeling less engaged,
Right.
they're going home exhausted, the boss is getting angry at them occasionally, and eventually the boss is probably going to say, you know what, we need to part ways. So if you can't learn, then you're not going to be able to adapt into the job that is changing under your very feet.
Mhm. I love that. I love that anecdote that you said about mystery shoppers, because I can totally see how, acting as a mystery shopper is probably something not being terribly disrupted. I think it's fun sometimes to think about the edge cases of those things. Another job that I think will be one of the last to be automated is stand-up comedian. I think that, artificial intelligence will have a pretty tough time figuring out the nuances of comedic timing. But,
Right.
you made a very compelling argument there. Oftentimes we think about, skills gaps in society, and we talk about how there can be tens of thousands of people looking for jobs and tens of thousands of jobs looking for people from time to time.
Right.
And we wonder why these things aren't lining up, or we talk about how we might get them to line up. And, one of the things I've thought about as we've engaged in this conversation is, if people have trouble learning new jobs, they'll have trouble adapting to those new jobs. And I think that that's probably one of the drivers of those mismatches that we're seeing.
Right, exactly.
Janet, I love that you often say we never present a problem without talking about solutions. So let's talk about solutions. What can we do to improve literacy rates? As different, policies, businesses. Let's just talk about the solutions.
Right. Well, of course, it starts in schools. I think that's where we always expect, the answer. Well, let's just get the schools to take care of this problem, right? Teachers should. And the truth is that, yes, we cannot afford to let a child get to grade 4 without being a good reader. And we're still letting that happen. If a child gets to grade 4 without being able to read well, they will spend the next 6 years working hard to drop out of school. It is just too hard for them to keep up with their peers, because the first 3 years the teacher will teach. For the rest of school, the teacher facilitates learning. And yes, they are doing teaching, but you are expected to learn on your own. You're expected to read, to learn, and therefore you will fall behind. And statistics have shown that doesn't work. On the other hand, we also know that there are kids graduating from high school that do not have the literacy skills they need. So we did a piece because there was a study done in Ontario of post-secondary students going in and coming out, and 25% of them were not at that full level 3 literacy that we've talked about being important, which means that yes, they were going, but they were having a hard time learning. They probably were at the lower end of their class because they weren't really learning everything that they were required to learn. They weren't, it was really they had to work really hard to get there. They might have graduated, but they weren't actually improving literacy while they were there. So schools have to make sure that kids are learning by grade 4. Post-secondary schools have to actually take anybody that has poor skills when they start and improve those skills as quickly as possible. And it can be done to help them to then learn the rest of what they're there for. It's a very expensive thing to go to school for, in post-secondary and not get the full benefit of what you're being exposed to. And then from schools, people go into the workplace. And you mentioned earlier, Scott, how, big business doesn't think it's their problem, but it is their problem. It's absolutely their problem. It's causing productivity issues. It's causing competitive issues. And we've really got we're known in the world for having a competitiveness problem in this country, and it can come back. I mean, it's not the only answer, but it's one of those answers, is to improve literacy. So if I would think that it would really pay employers to say, let's embed some literacy training without even mentioning that's what they're doing into their onboarding process. Let's get a sense of where you're at and whether you're actually capable of working independently on your own, reliably well at the job you're supposed to be doing. And if that's not working, there's a way to embed literacy training. It doesn't have to be, we're going to teach you how to read today.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, you'd have to embed it, because I'm sure some employees, I'd certainly bristle a little bit.
We would. You can't tell an adult that they don't know how to read. So what you do is you embed it so that there are ways to do it. Good quality instruction can help that in the workplace. And then, of course, the people who are long-term unemployed, people who've been chronically under or unemployed, the people who are going to be displaced from their jobs as automation comes in, part of any program that is going to happen for those people, and there's going to be more of them all the time, is to make sure that whenever they're getting their training for the new world that they're moving into, that literacy is embedded into those skills as well. And I got to say, I mean, we've been talking about literacy, but closely tied to literacy is numeracy, right? And we have a deeper problem in numeracy, but as the world is turning, numeracy is becoming more and more important as well. So we need to make sure that those numeracy pieces, we don't need to do algebra or calculus. we just need to be able to do basic mathematical functions in our brains, right? Like, we need to be able to sort of figure out roughly, does that look right? And that's another piece that people need to have as they're being upgraded for new employment.
I have to say, I was fortunate enough to go to this elementary school where the teachers put this huge emphasis on doing math in your head, and it has benefited me for my whole life. I notice it all the time. It was hilarious. Calculators were forbidden well into junior high, actually, but it's had some benefits to me as well. So it's fun to think about like that. I'm a really good estimator as a result of it.
Well, that's the thing, right? Like, I mean, there are people who don't understand that there's another zero that's needed here, right? And then
off by an order of magnitude.
Yeah, off by an order of magnitude. That is not good in this world, right? You can really get yourself into debt if you couldn't do the math, right?
What do we risk as businesses? What do we risk as, an economy if we don't solve this challenge?
Right. Well, let's just reverse everything we've just talked about, right? So the productivity and competitiveness will suffer. We published just a couple of years ago a study that we had the economic modelers do that showed that if we increase literacy rates across the country by just 1%, so average literacy rates by 1%, and remember that's 5 points on the 500-point scale. It's not much. It's not much. But if we were to do that, we would raise productivity by 3% GDP by 3%, and individual productivity by 5%. And that then translates to income generated by employers, which then they can then afford to pay their people more, which then puts the country in a better position. So macroeconomically, it's huge. And then for individuals, as I said, it makes life harder if you can't. So and it's an easy fix. The training doesn't have to take long. We can do the training in 20 hours to get that 1%, those 5 points. So we can get people to the level where they are reading more fluently, and then they can start to be more productive, and also that their lives can be easier. People who are more literate tend to be people who go and vote. They tend to be people who volunteer. They tend to be more engaged in their communities. And those are important things in this society. So I think what we chance on losing is an even less inclusive, less cohesive society. parents that are stressed because they don't have a job or because they can't do their job well enough and they're worried about losing it. Those parents are not always as fully engaged with their children as they might be. There's so many things that can go wrong when life is just so hard. So it's not that much of an investment that needs to be made to bring people to the level where they could do a little better for themselves, for their employers, and for society. When you think 3% on GDP, it's like, I don't know what it is this year, but it's at least $50 billion. It's not going to cost that much to get there. So yeah. I think it's a no-brainer, but I've been batting my head against this wall for a few years now.
2 final questions for you, Janet. First one, if you could wave a magic wand and impact or affect or create any policy that you think would advance this issue, what would that be?
Well, I think it does come down to, let's make sure that, can I have 2?
You can have 2.
You can
okay.
have.
Okay.
It is a magic wand after all.
Because I do think that I had a child who was reading before kindergarten, and I had another child who didn't read until the end of grade 3. And I saw what that did to her, because she knew she wasn't doing well in school in grade 3. She could see how her friends were doing better than she was. But then the magic happened for her. We did what we needed to do as parents. We were very, very fortunate. We saw the problem. We were able to get the help she needed. And she started to read. And I remember she read every book she could read in the Babysitters Club series, because my daughter's in her 30s, that summer, and it changed her life. She was able to do it. I don't want any children to go through that. I don't want any more children to go through that. So let's make it absolutely imperative that children who are not reading fluently by the end of grade 3, they pick it all up at different times. But let's say that by the end of grade 3, if you're not there, you get special help, one-on-one help until you can. And then you go back into the regular classroom, because life will change for those kids. And then the other piece is, let's make sure that the onboarding process, let's make a policy that says, when you're onboarding your employees, that you check to make sure that they've got the skills that they need for the job they're going to be doing. And if they don't fire them, train them.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Final question. What is one insight or idea that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Read. Just do it. Your literacy practice is the most important thing to maintaining your literacy skills. And because, as I've said, the world is changing, jobs are changing, you're going to have to adapt to new things in your job. I mean, heck, we've all done it already, but we're going to have to keep on doing it. You need to be ready for that. And so find some time in your day to read, whether you read for information, which is really important, or for pleasure, which is, there's nothing better than to curl up with a good book. And especially on a day like today, you got a cold drink, you're sitting in the sun or under the shade with a good book. Mm-hmm. Life doesn't get any better than that. So just read.
Bonus question for you. What are you reading right now?
I'm so glad you asked.
And what is your favorite book ever?
Oh, we're not going to be able to answer that question.
Okay, not the second one, but what are you reading now?
What are you reading now?
Well, actually,
I'm reading How the World Really Works by Lachlan Smil, and I'm just loving it at the moment. I'm telling everybody that I talk to. So what are you reading?
Well, that is on my coffee table, I will say, because it was a gift, right? But I got 4 books on the go, I think. I just finished listening on Audible to a murder mystery that was on Audible Plus by Joy Ellis. It was called The Stolen Boys. And it was like horror kind of stuff, but I don't normally read that. I've got a book called The Wiggly World of Organization, which is about how organizations really work, because all the management textbooks have got it wrong. And that's on my table. And I'm reading another one called Verity, which is, again, another one of those creepy things that my sister gave me to read and said, here, you've got to read this. It's really good. But that's because it's summer, right? I'm trying to enjoy some summer reads, but none of my novels lately have been terribly edifying. I'll tell you, my favorite book as a child was called What Katie Did by Susan Coolidge. And I remember it, I was, under the age of 10 when I read it. And it's about a little girl who was a wild and crazy character, and she fell off a swing, broke her back, and was confined to bed for quite a long time. This is a very old book, but it was all about how she managed to keep the world turning around her while she was in her bed. And I don't know why, it just stayed with me forever.
Well, thank you, Janet. We appreciate you spending today with us talking about reading and sharing some of your insights on literacy and a few book recommendations.
No, don't. The Wiggly World of Organization, for anybody who's in the field trying to figure out, what the solutions for management are. That's a good one. But anyway.
Awesome. Thanks, Janet, so much.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. We'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and TikTok. If you liked this episode and want to support our message of shared prosperity for all, head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts to subscribe, rate the show, and give us a quick review. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.